the heart of a small sleepy town, where time seemed to have a way of stretching like the afternoon shadows, there lived an old clockmaker named Abel. His shop was a curious place, filled with the steady ticking of hundreds of clocks. The walls were lined with timepieces of all sizes, from grand-grandfather clocks with brass pendulums swinging like the heartbeat of the past to delicate hand-carved cuckoo clocks that sounded the hours in whimsical tones. There was a story in every tick, a history in every tock. But there was one clock in his collection that was different from all the others, a clock he had never made himself. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a day like any other. A stranger entered his shop carrying the heavy wooden box with an ornate brass clock inside. It had a face unlike any Abel had ever seen. Its design was older than any clock in his shop, its hands delicate and carved with symbols Abel couldn't decipher. The stranger said little, only that it had been in his family for generations and that he had heard rumors about Abel's skill in repairing the broken, the forgotten, the unique. "I hope you can fix it," the man said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "It has a curious property, one that you might notice as soon as you touch it." The man left without another word, and Abel was left alone with the mysterious timepiece. As he inspected it, he noticed that its face was slightly cracked, and the brass gears inside were worn, but it was beautifully crafted, a relic from another time. After a few hours of tinkering, Abel managed to get the clock ticking again. As he wound it up, a strange sensation filled the room, something heavy, as though the air itself was holding its breath. When the hands moved, Abel thought he saw something shift in the shadows of the shop, but it was gone as quickly as it came. That night, as Abel sat in his worn chair, sipping a cup of tea, he heard a commotion outside. The familiar bell of the church rang out with a solemn tone. Too solemn, even for a late hour. Abel frowned, his fingers tightening around his teacup. Something was wrong. He stepped out into the quiet streets where the townspeople had gathered in hushed groups. At the center of the crowd stood a figure, a familiar face, Mayor Wendell. Abel's heart sank as he realized the man was not moving. The mayor had collapsed in the street. No one knew what had happened, only that it was sudden. Doctors and nurses rushed to the scene, but the mayor could not be revived. The next morning, as Abel entered his shop, he saw it again, the clock. It had stopped. The hands were frozen at 12:02. "Impossible," he murmured, staring at it. How could a clock like this stop on its own, as though it were responding to something outside its gears? Days passed and the town moved on, mourning the mayor's sudden death. But Abel could not shake the feeling that the clock was somehow involved. He inspected it more carefully but found nothing amiss. Still, he could not help but wonder. Weeks later, a much darker event occurred. Abel's wife, Hannah, whom he had known and loved for nearly 50 years, fell ill suddenly, so suddenly in fact that there was no time for Abel to do anything but sit by her side. Doctors came, but their medicines were of no use. Her condition worsened, and she passed away quietly in the night. Once again, Abel found himself staring at the clock. It had stopped. The hands were frozen at 3:47. Abel's world was quiet now, but in a way that was different from the peaceful stillness of his shop. The clock had never worked like this before. He knew that the events surrounding its stoppages were not coincidental. The clock was tied to something darker, something more powerful than mere time. The years passed slowly, and though Abel was used to loss, the clock seemed to drag him deeper into it, its silent warning ever present in his workshop. He found it carefully each day, but still the hands never moved past the time of his wife's death and the mayor's demise. One spring afternoon, as the sun bathed the streets in warm golden light, Abel was in the middle of fixing a particularly stubborn wall clock when he heard the familiar jingle of the shop's bell. A little boy entered, a boy he immediately recognized, his nephew Theo. Theo had been a curious child, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked. Abel had not seen him in some time, for the boy had grown up and moved to the city. "Uncle Abel," Theo said, his eyes wide with wonder as he gazed at the walls of clocks. "I've missed this place." Abel smiled warmly. "It's good to see you, Theo. You've grown so much." They spent the afternoon talking, reminiscing, and as the shadows grew long, Abel suggested they take a walk around the block. Theo was now a young man, but he still had that childlike curiosity. They spoke of the town, of life, and of memories, until the sudden screech of brakes cut through the air. Abel turned to see a car skidding toward the curb, its tires screeching on the wet road. He barely had time to react before Theo, who had stepped out into the street, was struck by the vehicle. Time seemed to stretch in that moment, the world around Abel slowing down as he rushed to his nephew's side. Theo was unconscious, his body sprawled awkwardly on the asphalt. The driver of the car had already leaped out, panic-stricken, and was calling for help. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, and doctors and nurses appeared, working frantically to save Theo. But Abel could only focus on the one thing that had been in his life for so long: the clock. He rushed back to his shop, his hands trembling as he reached for the old timepiece. The hands were ticking, but only just. He could feel the tremors in the air, the pulse of the world, as though the very fabric of time was bending under the weight of what was happening. Abel dropped to his knees before the clock, his hands moving with a speed and precision he hadn't known he still had. He twisted the gears, adjusted the springs, and for the first time in years, the clock began to hum with a deep, resonant sound. It was as though it were alive, its rhythm synchronizing with the frantic pulse of his own heart. Outside, the doctors worked furiously, their movements precise and quick. Abel did not look up. He could hear only the ticking of the clock, growing louder, growing faster, as though it were propelling him forward. With one final turn of the wrench, he set the clock to its full motion. And in that moment, Theo's chest gave a sudden rise, a gasp. The doctors looked up astonished. It was as though a miracle had occurred. Theo's breathing was steady, his heart was beating again. Abel closed his eyes, a sense of relief flooding his chest. He did not know how or why, but the clock had done what nothing else could, had pulled Theo from the brink. Years passed and Theo grew older, moving on with his life. Abel continued his work repairing clocks, but the strange timepiece never left his side. He never fully understood how it worked or what it meant, but he knew that it had somehow altered the course of fate that day. One evening, years later, when Theo was a grown man and had children of his own, they gathered around the fireplace in his home, eager for a bedtime story. The children, always in search of something thrilling, asked for a ghost story, or perhaps a horror story. Theo smiled and without hesitation began. "I know a story," he said, his voice soft, "about my grandfather's clock. An old clock made by a man named Abel, who was a clockmaker unlike any other. It wasn't just a clock. It was something much more, something that could stop time itself." He paused, watching his children's eyes widen with curiosity. "Sometimes," he continued, "it wasn't the clock that decided when time stopped. It was life itself. And when the clock stopped, it was always in the moments that mattered most." And with that, the children snuggled deeper into their blankets, waiting for the next word as the sound of a ticking clock, so faint, so distant, continued on in the background.